Now, welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Some Star Wars, where this time we'll be taking a look at the results of the poll that asked you, do you want to see The Mandalorian connect to the sequel trilogy? I'll then be reading and responding to some of the comments that were left, as well as showing off some of the artwork that's been sent in to me lately, and yes, I know it's been a while since I did that. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right to the results, where we'll see that 45% of people said no, The Mandalorian should have nothing to do with the sequels at all. 21% then said no, it should have little or nothing to do with them. 17% were basically neutral and didn't care much either way. 14% said yes, they think there should be a connection to some degree. And a final 2% said yes, they should absolutely connect, and in major ways. And before even discussing this any further, let me just say that yes, these results are no doubt skewed or biased to some degree since I am not the most pro-sequel trilogy channel out there, which means many who watch my videos likely feel the same way as I do. That said, and as we'll soon see when we get to the comments, this wasn't even necessarily a question about liking or disliking the sequels. There were some who said they liked the sequels just fine, but they didn't want to see a connection, and there were those who said they hated the sequels, but said they wouldn't mind seeing a connection if it mainly fixed the problems with the sequels. So basically, as is oftentimes the case with these polls, the actual results are only part of the story, and you have to dig into the comments to get the rest of it, which I of course did by reading through all of them. And before getting to some of them in particular, let me take a moment to thank everyone who does indeed leave a comment, as well as those of you who vote and watch the videos, and to those of you who send in your artwork. And speaking of that, if you have sent me something in the last few months and you don't see it in this video, do feel free to send it again. I get a lot of email, and a ton of it is spam or junk mail, but I do try to read and respond to as many people as I can. But if I don't respond to you, or again, you don't see your artwork, don't take it personally. Again, my inbox is always flooded with junk and spam, to the point where I've contemplated just making a new email address for people to contact me at. Anyway, let's now get to the comments, and start as we always do with the top-rated one, which this time came to us from Saeed Manemna, and my apologies, I probably just butchered your name. Anyway, they had this to say. None of the options above use me as it should connect only if it overwrites the sequel trilogy. And well, it'll probably come as no surprise, but there were a lot of comments very similar to this one that said the only sort of connection they want to see is one that overwrites the sequels, which is something I'm not opposed to. I'm all for a better, more cohesive post-Return of the Jedi story than the one we got. However, and mainly for the sake of those of you who do enjoy the sequels, I'd like to at least see them keep some of the elements of the sequels intact, or maybe I should say, I'd like to see it where the sequels are still on track to happen, but then some big singular event occurs that changes everything, changes the events of the sequel films, from ever coming to pass. Something like, for example, Ezra using the world between worlds to go back and inform Luke that Palpatine has returned, or will return, and then he gets stopped by Luke before that ever happens, hence the sequels never happen. And mind you, I'm not a huge fan of alternate realities and time travel in Star Wars. I actually pretty much hate those ideas in Star Wars, but I am someone who would love to find a solution that maybe somehow makes all or most fans happy when it comes to the sequels. And if it's done that way, everything from the sequels can still basically be canon. It would have still happened if not for Ezra, or it does still happen in this alternate reality or timeline, one that could certainly still be built upon in books, comics, or wherever, but the new timeline being introduced in The Mandalorian right now would be the one mainly focused on going forward. Alright, and next up here then we have this comment from Ocean Bacon who said, they've basically already connected them in Chapter 4, but they did it in a vague way, so as long as they keep doing stuff that's open to interpretation, and not just telling the audience that these things are connected, then yeah, I'm fine with it. We also then had this one from Ryan Sargent, who said, I'm okay with aliens, ships, and even locations, perhaps a heist on Canto Bight or a visit to Maz Kanata's castle might be cool, but the plot points should be avoided. I don't want this to turn into the rise of the First Order. And kind of going along with my response to that first comment, but I'd be fine assuming the sequels were somehow made a part of an alternate reality, if all these things like Maz's castle and all the ships, planets, and aliens that we saw or were introduced would still exist in the Star Wars galaxy. Which even then means characters like Finn and Poe and Solo could still be around and have similar or maybe vastly different stories from the ones they were given in the sequels. Maybe even Rey could still exist and get a different story this time around. Maybe after Luke destroys Palpatine once and for all this time, She somehow learns about her grandfather's legacy, becomes angry that he robbed her of her family, and then seeks vengeance upon him and his family, and becomes the main antagonist of a new sequel trilogy. Who knows what could be done? Again, I may not be a huge fan of the sequels, but I'm certainly open to compromise if it means bringing some sort of peace to the fanbase. Alright, and next up here then we have this comment from Joshua Cotton, who said, honestly for me, I don't see any scenario where they completely erase the sequels, so the only two realistic options are to either use The Mandalorian or some other show as the Clone Wars of the sequels, i.e. trying to use the show to enhance the sequels, like the Clone Wars did for the prequels, or to just completely ignore the sequels. I'd prefer the latter. Then we also have this comment here from Jerison Poe, who said, I picked the yes to some degree option. My thinking is that the Clone Wars was a way to expand on the prequels and really flesh out these smaller bits of the story, turning the page for some prequel haters to enjoy them somewhat. There is a lot of hate for the sequels, me included, but I believe that by bridging the gap and building around the story, it can help fix some of the sins of the sequels, assuming Filoni really is the second coming of Lucas. Also here we have this comment from Rusty Bricks, who said, if the sequels are here to stay, then I would rather have some continuity rather than none. I'm not saying we need an origin story for Poe's parents' shoelaces, but some attempt by the man, Dave Filoni, who had a role in redeeming the prequels to provide some rational explanation for the state of the galaxy in Episode 7 is welcome. Knowing where the galaxy ends up in 30 years really adds some ominous weight to the Imperial and Rebel engagements in The Mandalorian. If the writers of The Mandalorian can use that weight to benefit the show, then count me in. Next then we have this comment here from Isaiah Traubelin, who said, seeing how Dave Filoni's Clone Wars saved the prequels, I think it would do the same for the sequels. And then finally in this little block of comments we have this one from Mr. Hockey 1436, who said, personally, I did not enjoy the sequel trilogy whatsoever. However, considering the success of the Clone Wars, there could be potential here. The Clone Wars added on to the prequel trilogy and made a lot of aspects of it better. I wonder if The Mandalorian could somehow add to the sequel trilogy in a similar fashion. Maybe it'll have some connections and make aspects of the sequel trilogy better. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, so I certainly think this is another sort of option that they may take with The Mandalorian, and probably the most likely one if we're being honest. That they'll try to directly or indirectly make the sequels better by giving them greater context with a show like The Mandalorian, by somehow explaining some of the things that maybe just don't make a whole lot of sense right now as is. However, I think the biggest issue with that is that, first of all, there's a lot of people that just want The Mandalorian to be its own thing. And they're very much enjoying what it is so far. They're enjoying a smaller scale show where the fate of the galaxy isn't necessarily on the line, even though, yes, especially in the last few episodes, it has introduced many new characters and potentially much larger threats. And if this did start to connect to the sequels in a major way, if it becomes like a full-on prequel to them, then that would be quite the change of pace from what it's been, or you could even call it a bait and switch even. Because even though, yes, the Clone Wars did a lot for the prequels, and there is potential, I suppose, for some sort of show to do the same for the sequels, by calling it the Clone Wars and sandwiching it in between episodes 2 and 3, and using many of the main characters from the movies, well, no one should have been surprised that it tied into and did a lot for the films. Everything about it implies that's exactly what it was going to do. But calling something The Mandalorian and advertising it as the story of a solitary bounty hunter making his way through the Outer Rim, and then turning it into something that goes out of its way to explain the sequels, is again basically a bait and switch, and one a lot of people are going to reject. Even though, as I said, it already does feel like the show is getting a bit bigger in scale than maybe some expected, but at least it's so far dealing with these things in a very relevant to the time period way. Furthermore, and as I've talked about before, the difference with the prequels over the sequels is that many will agree, even those who don't like the prequel films, that the story of the prequels and all the world building it does is very solid. It's mainly the execution of the films that they have an issue with. That doesn't exactly hold true for the sequels. In fact, it's the story that most people don't like, and some of the problems they have, like the way Luke was handled, for example, cannot be patched up and fixed. For some, there's just no way to ever save what was done to a character like Luke Skywalker and many of the other issues they have, short of throwing that version away and starting over entirely. Okay, and now let's move on to this comment from Star Wars Hour, who said, I don't mind it being connected, but I think that sometimes if you try and connect everything, then it's not going to flow together nicely. Also, there's this one from Weapon N. Browning who said, honestly, an issue I have with a lot of today's writing is that everyone tries to have a connected universe. The problem is you have to really plan in order to have a universe that is all connected. The reason why it works for Marvel is because that was the idea from the beginning with both the comics and the MCU. There's nothing wrong with building your universe lore with more incidents that don't connect with each other. Also, most of the MCU is set in Earth, one planet, while Star Wars is a large, expansive galaxy. To boil it down, everyone doesn't have to be Marvel to succeed, just be you. And I do agree with you, and in an odd sort of way, the MCU is the best and worst thing that ever happened to entertainment, because I do think most of us love the idea of the shared universe, especially, of course, when it's actually planned out and well executed like it was with the MCU. But the problem is now everyone wants to do the same thing that Marvel did. Everything has to be connected or in a shared universe these days. And mind you here, Star Wars had long since created a rich, lore-filled, shared universe. I'm not saying they're copying Marvel right now with anything they're doing, nor am I saying they're doing it wrong with The Mandalorian, which of course is tying heavily into a lot of previously established lore. But the thing is, it didn't have to. It could have been its own completely separate thing. And though I love when little threads tie things together from one story to the next, at some point I do think Star Wars should and will have to create some totally new and original stories, separate from anything and everything else done before. And I don't just mean in the books and comics with things like the High Republic era, but with some of their shows and movies. I think they need to find a good balance of continuing some of these ongoing stories, if you will, and just making some new, unique, and original things. I think that's the healthiest way to approach Star Wars going forward. Alright, and now time for a final few comments before wrapping this up, starting with this one from Andre Nitro times 1000 who said, listen, I see the value of connecting stories like how the Clone Wars did or even Rebels, but this is a show that has taken my mind off the dreadful Disney trilogy, and anything that reminds me of it immediately turns me off. I don't mind if it has subtle Easter eggs, but if it affects the story, then it's the beginning of the end for me. Then there's this comment from Bill Williams who said, I feel like Dave and John are going to use The Mandalorian to help explain some things that weren't explained in the sequel trilogy, mainly how the First Order took complete control of the galaxy in like 40 years. I really hope The Mandalorian stays out of it, but it would also be nice to actually understand that. Then we have this one from Connor Nicholas who said, the sequel trilogy was so divisive that I think the show's best bet is to not touch it. Then this one from Hector who said, the show has the ability to go in a new direction and avoid the mistakes of the sequels. Or this one from Hudson Navarro who said, it has nothing to do with the quality of the sequels, it's just that I want it to be its own thing, please. Then there's this one from J. Lou Bird who said, I don't think it needs to, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if it did in a small way. I just don't want Mando to join the Resistance or something huge like that. Also this one from Joe L. who said, the whole purpose of these series for Disney is to fill in the gaps to their sequel mess. Then there's also this one from Mandalorian Steve, which is a bit on the long side to read in the video, but it's certainly worth pausing and reading yourself if you'd like. Next we have this one from Obese Bird who said, Filoniverse should be the new Star Wars. Let him create the future. And then there's this one from Pawar LOS who said, the sequel trilogy failed miserably to establish its place in Star Wars. I don't want The Mandalorian to waste any time picking up the sequel's slack. And finally here we have this comment from Sean Hughes who said, I would prefer if it stayed more standalone, but if they connected in a good way, I would be fine with it. As long as it's good, I don't truly care what they do. And though I wouldn't exactly say I don't care what they do, though I do get your point, I certainly do want it to continue to be good no matter what they decide. And if it rewrites the sequels, I do hope it does it in a way that doesn't anger the sequel trilogy fans, if that's possible. And if it connects to the sequels in a big way, I hope it manages to somehow salvage those films for those who don't like them, if that's possible. And if it just sort of vaguely references the sequels and never really commits one way or the other, well then so be it, I guess. Again, just as long as it continues to be good, I think most of us are going to be happy. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Should The Mandalorian connect to the sequels, and if so, how much? Or should it maybe begin to overwrite them? Or is just sort of ignoring them the best option? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.